Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. This podcast is recorded on behalf of the ITSS Verona think tank and is hosted by me, Federico Sergio, and the US team leader, Anurag Mishra. Today we are exploring how recent events in the United States, including ongoing litigation over ballot access and redistricting, as well as debate over federal versus state control of elections, are shaping the political landscape ahead of the 2026 midterms. We would like to explore how these developments affect public trust, institutional legitimacy, and the broader stability of US democracy. We are delighted to have with us today Dr. Lauren Prather, Associate Professor of Political Science at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy and co-director of the Center for Transparent and Trusted Elections. She's also the co-author of Monitors and Meddlers, How Foreign Actors Influence Local Trust in Elections by Cambridge University Press, which won the Best Book Award for the American Political Science Association Foreign Policy section. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Prather.
Thank you for having me.
We are seeing intense friction between federal legislative efforts like the proposed Save American Act and the traditional constitutional framework of state-led election administration. How do you assess the long-term impact of this nationalization narrative on the federalist system? And one specific risk do you see if the federal government continues to bypass state-level process regarding voter registration and verification?
So I think this is a very important issue, and it's one that has some history in the United States. There has been federal involvement in elections, despite the fact that the Constitution states very clearly that states are to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. But the federal involvement in elections has been very limited and has mostly been around increasing access to voting. So, making it legal for women to vote, protecting the rights of communities of color to vote free of intimidation and undue regulation, restricting their access. So again, mostly federal involvement in elections in the United States has been about expanding access. So one thing that's different about the SAVE Act is that the SAVE Act would limit access for individuals across the United States, partially because one of the key tenets of the SAVE Act is to require proof of citizenship for voting. And in the United States, there are a lot of individuals who don't necessarily have proof of citizenship, despite having something like an ID card that they could still show at the ballot box. So it's not required for Americans to show proof of citizenship, for example, to get a driver's license. But normally when we register to vote here, we may show that ID and there may be some verification about where that individual lives to make sure they're voting in the right state. And certainly there would be some assessment that the person that is voting is the person that is filling out the ballot. So mail-in ballots, for example, go through signature verification to try to make sure that there's no fraud occurring. And what we've seen is there's very little voter fraud occurring at all in the United States. So that is just something that doesn't happen. And the SAVE Act is being positioned as addressing this concern, despite the fact that it is a rare or extremely rare occurrence. And so one of the key issues is that Americans feel that this SAVE Act will restrict access for a lot of individuals who may not have proof of citizenship. So they may not know where their birth certificate is. And a lot of Americans don't have passports, which would show their citizenship on them. And so that is going to make it really challenging for a lot of Americans to vote. And so this SAVE Act that is trying to address a problem that doesn't really exist is now going to disenfranchise a lot of people. And so, there's a lot of debate this week in the US Senate to potentially pass the act. I don't know if it's going to pass, but if it does, it will limit the ability of a lot of Americans to vote.
Thank you. And I would like to continue with the rhetoric surrounding foreign elections interference and the way seizure of election material by federal agents has fundamentally changed how many voters perceive the chain of custody in the elections. From an institutional perspective, how can state elections officials maintain public trust in 2026 results when a significant portion of the electorate has been conditioned to believe that the federal government itself is the primary threat to election integrity?
One of the things that our center is trying to do is to assist local and state election officials in reaching voters and communicating with them about the security of election procedures in their state or in their county. What we're seeing in the United States is a battle between the states and the federal government around elections. But what's clear is that in states and in counties and cities, election officials are running elections with extremely high levels of integrity. And we know that the process that they are managing is extremely secure. Now, the federal government might be trying to pass laws that would restrict access or allow things like redistricting that is going to ultimately warp the will of the people in those states. But we know that despite what's happening at the federal level or despite the laws that exist, that these election officials are following the laws and are implementing the laws and are conducting themselves and the electoral process with extremely high levels of integrity. So we're trying to assist those election officials in communicating that to the public in an effort to at least build confidence in that part of the process. What's going on at the federal level is something that we can help to mitigate the blowback of, but if it continues, it ultimately will degrade trust in elections, despite what efforts the local and state election officials put into communicating that the electoral process itself is very secure and accurate. So these are kind of the things that state and local election officials are trying to balance right now. The fact that they are doing a good job, they're doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, and following the law and protecting the vote. But at the federal level, the laws are changing or potentially changing in a way that might degrade democracy and degrade trust. So we're trying to at least maintain trust in the local and state election officials. But we can't help the fact that there are these federal actions that are happening that ultimately might lower trust in elections. And I will say, one of the things that we've been thinking about at our center is whether or not lower trust in the accuracy, integrity of elections is warranted given these federal actions. So in previous years, there have been a lot of talk about US elections, especially from elites, especially from Donald Trump, talking about how elections are not free and fair, or talking about things like voter fraud. And these things are essentially misinformation because they're not occurring. And so our support of election officials was meant to try to counter some of that misinformation, because people had an inaccurate view about how democratic US elections were and whether they were actually free and fair. So we were trying to correct a view that was not accurate. At this moment in time, with changes to election law, with redistricting, with the potential for the SAVE Act to pass and potentially disenfranchise a number of Americans, the fact that we see declining trust in elections might be just an accurate assessment of what's going on in the United States. And so we've had to try to think about like, actually, is this something that we need to correct? Maybe this is actually the correct view. People are observing what's happening, observing actual decline in how democratic US elections are, and are updating their trust in US elections. And I think the important thing will be if the federal government, if states are able to go back and take back control of elections and make the playing field level again, how can we rebuild that trust after these types of interventions have degraded it? And so that's something that we're going to be looking towards in the future.
If I may speak, I was curious that like we read about that there are qualms among people and leaders about that people who are not citizens are voting in elections. So this is one way to say that some people are of course going to be disenfranchised by the new law. But the important thing is, has the government come up with some kind of initiative to make having a national identification card available to people, like
Right.
people who do not yet have an identification?
Right.
Do they have an option of getting one in the near future, so that once they have or fulfill all the requirements, they can actually have a card and they can flash it in front of the you know polling
Mhm.
booth and say that I'm registered to vote, and I have my ID, I have everything in place, so I must vote. So
Yes.
is there something that the government has come up with?
No, no. So you bring up a great point because there are countries around the world, including Mexico, for example, our neighbor, that requires voter ID when you go to the polls. But at the same time, the government is set up to issue those IDs to everybody, regardless of whether or not, they're driving or regardless of how much they can pay to get such an ID, right? And so you're exactly right that on its own, it's somewhat innocuous, right? And it might even be good to have an ID requirement, but it has to be paired with the resources to get those IDs into the hands of individuals. And so I think what we're seeing is a requirement without the resources for state and federal authorities to actually enable people to vote in the face of these new obligations and requirements. So I would definitely not say that I'm opposed to something like an ID requirement, but I am opposed to it if there are no resources or investment in helping people obtain it. The other thing is it's happening at such a late stage in the election cycle. Normally, something like this would be considered and applied to, let's say, the 2028 presidential election. But putting such a requirement in place in anticipation of the 2026 midterms and putting no resources behind it. I just was listening to a podcast yesterday where, and by the way, we're talking about not just ID cards, we're talking about proof of citizenship, right? So we're talking about like birth certificates. Where you would actually have to go and prove that you were, born in the United States or, have some other kind of documentation that would prove that. And this podcast that I was listening to mentioned that there are as many as 6,000 different types of birth certificates in the United States because they're issued by very local governments, right? And so I'm imagining the election officials that we support having to find the resources and the time to evaluate all of these different types of birth certificates and figure out which are legitimate, which are, fraudulent. That is going to take just such an immense amount of time and resources for these individuals who are overworked already in terms of the expectations for their job and under-resourced for what they're expected to do. The fact that this is even being considered for the 2026 midterms is really outrageous. That it's going to cause a lot of chaos and a lot of disenfranchisement. So, thank you for bringing up that point. I do think, again, pairing this type of legislation with the resources is absolutely imperative. Otherwise, it's going to create an disenfranchisement and a lot of headaches for people that are just trying to run good elections.
Right. It would be a nightmare for people to authenticate these birth certificates.
Exactly.
And maybe if they gave the people some headway to, like, we're going to do this by 2030, and we're going to put in 4 years into it, and we're going to authenticate every claim of citizenship, and we're going to give people opportunity to obtain,
Yes.
But yeah, let's see what happens to the act itself. Yeah, the bill itself. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Federico. I think
Yeah, we
should
are.
I ask the next question is about the red lines, right? So yeah, it's so well, the question is like looking ahead of time, like what's going to happen, and with the background being the democracy and all the rhetoric about it. Uh, you know, the norms, the democratic norms that we talk about in the US democracy, if crossed during the 2026 midterms, the red lines, if there's something which happens, an occurrence which says that, no, we have had it, it's completely and, blatantly undemocratic. Uh, would it go on to change the political landscape of the US in an irreversible manner that it cannot go back to the time where it used to be a vibrant democracy or like that. So uh, and everything that is happening currently, both in the domestic arena as well as the international forum, the war and everything. So, is there something we have heard about, the War Powers Act and how the tariffs, which were called unconstitutional by the Supreme Court itself. So, is there something? Are there any red lines, or how far can this presidency go?
Mm-hmm.
And when it can have an impact, which is probably irreversible, that even if the government changes the next elections, we cannot go back to the time that when we had all of those things. So do you think there are some red lines, and if there are, which would be those? For example, like if had Donald Trump not stepped down
Right.
after the election, and would
Yeah.
not vacate the office, that we could say that it was a red line, that it had never happened before, that somebody who lost the election just said, no, I'm not
Yeah.
vacating the office. So, do you think there could be something similar, or what would it be,
Yeah.
if at all it happens? So, yeah.
So I think the most common one that the academic class has been considering is the cancellation of elections, or even the federal takeover of certain election sites or states. But I think the cancellation of elections, a national emergency. We've even, seen Donald Trump talking a little bit about this. He said he would consider canceling the elections, and he said he would never do that. But it's
There's
certainly some,
also the third term talk that
and
he'll
there's the
become the
third term
vice
talk.
president, and then he'll become the president again.
Right,
So yeah, all of that. Yes.
right.
Yeah. Please go on. Sorry.
Um, no, but I think the cancellation is a good example here because um, I'm on record in the past about Trump as sort of saying, we should take him at his word. I was pretty convinced before the 2020 election that when he said he would fight the results of that election, I was not surprised at all to see something like January 6th occur. And I do think every time we underestimate him or um, say, oh, he's just kidding, he can't possibly mean this, I think we make a big mistake in underestimating his willingness to cross those lines. Now, what I will say is, I think canceling an election is an extremely risky move for a leader. And we've seen this all over the world. Elections are focal points for citizens, and they're focal points for other elites in society. And I do believe that the Trump administration understands this and would try to be strategic about this. So my expectation is that we won't see something like that red line being crossed because, again, my expertise in studying democracy around the world is that leaders want to manipulate elections and get elected in a way that's as the least risky to their survival. So it would be much better and is much better for leaders around the world to manipulate elections but let them go on rather than canceling them. And so I think some of these efforts, like the SAVE Act, like redistricting, like some of the executive orders we've seen out of the administration, are attempts to kind of mold the election to get the result that Trump wants, and that some elements of the Republican Party would prefer, because that's the least risky strategy. I think if we do see something like a serious effort to cancel the midterms, claim a national emergency, I think you will see two checks on that power activated. I think you will see the legal system jump into action and challenge very seriously the administration's ability to do that. And then I think you will see the people, go to the streets in a way we haven't seen before if the elections are canceled. And again, if you think about game theoretically and sort of cost benefit analysis, it's much less costly for the administration to try to manipulate elections than to cancel them and have to repress mass protests. Like that is just not a world that this administration wants to be in. And so I'm not sure what would trigger that kind of desperation. But I don't think we're there yet. And I think we will see them try everything but that. And I think we may never actually see that because I think looking down the game tree, they're going to assess the fact that that's just going to be too costly for them to actually do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And as an international security student, I cannot ignore the elephant in the room in terms of US foreign policy right now. So my question is about the ongoing US-Israeli military operation in Iran, which has fundamentally shifted the national conversation and represent a significant escalation in US foreign policy. How do you believe these sudden and large-scale engagements will filter into the 2026 midterm discourse? And do you think we're going to see these drive rally around the flag effects for the current administration, so on Donald Trump, or will the cost and volatility of the conflict become a wedge issue that dominates the domestic political agenda?
So my expectation here is sort of depends on how the war goes. I think if it's over in the next couple of weeks, even if there's continued chaos in the Middle East, which I expect there likely would be, but if US active involvement in the war is over in, let's say a month or 2 months, I think it will have no impact on the midterms. I think the news cycle moves so fast in the United States, and honestly, there are so many things that the Trump administration does. We're not even talking about anymore the capture of the Venezuelan leader. I mean, that to me was such a shocking foreign policy move, and I have barely heard any conversation about that. And I expect this to operate the same way, especially in sort of the public discussion, if it goes quickly. I think if it drags on, if it affects oil prices, if it affects if there are troops on the ground, if there's a significant U.S. presence that leads to military deaths, I think then we could start to see an impact on the midterms. But I also think this is why Trump won't do that. So I think, again, I think the administration is strategic enough to know when to kind of cut their losses, so to speak. And so I think if they're out of there in a month, even if there are service members killed, even if there's an effect on oil prices and gas prices, I think even if those gas price effects and effects on the economy are still there in 3 or 4 months, there will probably be a narrative around how it's not actually the war in Iran that did that, it's something else. And I think people will, again, have kind of short memories and will buy some of those arguments, and it won't have a huge effect. I think the context here also matters. I think if this were a presidential election, we could see the impact be a little bit stronger. But I also think because this is a federal election, but not for the president, the filter down effect to affect individual like Republicans in the Senate or Republicans in the House of Representatives, the impact is going to be more diffuse and more difficult to tie to any one candidate. And so I think if Trump were up for re-election and we're going to be running his campaign, starting now for a presidential election in 2026, I think we could be talking about bigger impacts. But I think the midterms, it's also just kind of challenging because the president wields so much power over U.S. foreign policy and has such a strong impact on the decisions, such as to take these aggressive actions in Iran. Candidates for House and Senate in the United States can more easily maneuver and say they don't support the president's actions or they didn't support the president's actions, or they can sort of offload some of that responsibility in a way that I think will lessen the impact of this on those individual candidates. So I think with those two parts of it, the fact that they're sort of like short memory, and if the war's over quickly, and there's something new that we're all talking about, and combined with the fact that it's not a presidential election year, I think the actual impact on the upcoming elections is going to be pretty minimal unless some of the conditions that I just described were to appear.
Yeah, I think maybe it's by design. It's an operation that if it results in a massive success, and if the regime in Iran is actually routed and the region becomes more peaceful, it can even embolden the prospects for the Republican Party in the midterms. So maybe by design, it's not a failure campaign, but it's a campaign that they're trying to ride back on, and get success in the midterms,
Yeah.
because like historically, the president's party loses seats. So maybe this is a way that they can maybe turn things around for the party in the midterms, because the legislative agenda, I think, is kind of big for them. And so yeah, so basically we are done with the questions, and so
Great.
I would just like to thank you for agreeing to do it, and enlightening us, and the people who are going to watch this episode. I think they're going to learn new things from it, and we look forward to more engagement with you. And thanks a lot for doing it. Thank you, Federico, for taking the lead in this and arranging everything. So it's wonderful to have you, and yeah,
Thanks for
thank
an
you so
interesting
much
discussion.
for
Yeah, thank you for an interesting
we
discussion.
look forward to having more. Yes, thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you very
so
much.
Right.